sorry. Thank you to Amy for that great introduction too. Really appreciate it. Okay, so the figure of the alien in much of science fiction, whether it be books, movies, or video games, is often understood from a human perspective. In many cases, aliens are cast as hostile invaders of Earth, bent on destroying or enslaving humanity. While this is certainly not the extent of how extraterrestrials are represented in all sci-fi, its continued popularity is evident through the many video games that position the player as humanity's savior from otherworldly beings. Through the combination of invader and unknown, the alien is othered by virtue of being physically and culturally different, as well as being the enemy. Bungie's sci-fi first-person shooter, Destiny 2, is another in the long line of shooter games where the player fights back against hordes of enemy aliens to defend humankind. Destiny 2 is a large game, so an equally wide array of combatants are encountered throughout it, totaling 6 unique enemy factions comprised of dozens of individual units. By way of the game's ever-expanding story and lore, the individual histories, cultures, and perspectives of these groups are revealed. Despite their undeniable status as the other, Destiny 2's combatants are more than creepy enemies to shoot. They are their own peoples, and this layer of understanding helps to render them familiar. This presentation will examine the 6 enemy alien races in Destiny 2 in terms of gameplay, narrative presence, and representation through their naming. I argue that although these various alien groups are inherently othered by their contrast against humanity, they are continually made more familiar all the same, as they reflect different points of humanity's own history, culture, and mythology. To allow a nuanced discussion of Destiny 2's multitude of foes more readily, I wish to take some time to provide further context regarding the game's narrative. Destiny 2 takes place an unknown number of years into the future, when a post-apocalyptic solar system that has seen much of an evolved humanity wiped out. Higher paracausal, a term Bungie created as a neologism for magic, powers at war, serve as the backdrop where the human race's rise in the Golden Age and subsequent fall in the collapse. In the wake of this collapse, and in pursuit of the Traveler, an entity that used its light to uplift humanity and create Destiny 2's player avatars, the Guardians, several alien factions have invaded Earth and its neighboring planets and moons. These are, in order of my discussion, the Cabal, Fallen, Hive, Vex, Scorn, and Taken. In some way, every enemy bears some relation to an aspect of humanity and its culture, history, and stories, with these connections primarily evidenced in the humanized unit and faction names of each race. Unit names represent not just their roles in gameplay, but also their connection to humankind that familiarizes them. In his article on The Other in the Post-Apocalyptic Alien Shooter, Ryan Lazardi states that, quote, "It is in their similarities that the connection can be made that these creatures do not simply denote a completely alien race attacking the humans, but instead they connote a race of humans that is strange and foreign to the protagonists," unquote. Aliens can be understood as beings within the same range as humans via their derivation from humanity. In the case of Destiny 2, aliens are representative of human culture and history in a way that helps to familiarize them, often reducing their status as othered. The first race I will examine are the heavily militarized Cabal Empire. Their brute force tactics and overwhelming numbers solidify their status as war incarnate, which is further showcased through their unrelenting nature in combat. Even their spawn animation is aggressive, as giant drop pods hurtle from above without warning, flattening guardians before dissolving to deploy reinforcements. The player is told early on in encounters with the Cabal that they have 6 words for attack and none for retreat, as they are consistently defined as conquerors on a massive scale. The naming of their individual enemy units is derived from Roman imperial army titles and terms, including the legionary fodder soldiers, the shield-armed phalanx, and their centurion commanders. To further the Rome inspiration, the term Cabal does not reflect their military prowess exactly, but instead gestures towards their traitorous leadership, as the former Emperor Callus was deposed by a coalition of rebels, including his own daughter. From their focus on military conquest to their backstab-prone leadership, the Cabal Empire are an extreme rendition of humanity's own Roman Empire, which connects them to humankind through a shared point in history. One of the more recent events in Destiny 2's ongoing story is the fall of the Cabal Empire as it was previously known, as their homeworld was destroyed and the remaining legions have fled to humanity's solar system under command of Empress Keitel. While the Cabal Empire fell much like its historical human equivalent, it is the character of Keitel that makes the largest strides in bridging the gap between the Cabal and humanity. Gordon Litchfield et al.'s article on writing the alien in sci-fi posits that, quote, "Since all stories are written for human readers, we, the readers, must judge the alien's behavior in terms of our own value system. This means that our stories about aliens are still basically about humans," unquote. The idea of alien stories being like those that we know, despite the alien's inherent otherness, is reflected best in how Keitel has developed as a character. Although she starts as an adversary, her determination to not repeat the failures of her predecessors, especially her father Callus, results in a strong alliance between the forces of humanity and the Cabal remnants. The ramifications of this coalition are present in certain gameplay missions, where the player fights alongside and protects Cabal allies against mutual threats. Keitel's story is a human one, as she continually fights against the past and traditions to broker a new peace with what were formerly powerful enemies. Her development broadens the previous understanding of the Cabal as war-hungry and unreasonable by presenting a relatable figure, one who chooses to buck tradition and ally with the Guardians. The Cabal as a whole reflect humanity's history of conflict, but Keitel breaks down the barriers of the other through an acknowledgement of her and her people's flaws and the capability to change, traits previously unheard of in Destiny 2's aliens. The next race I will examine is the Fallen, a group of intergalactic pirates with a special expertise in scavenging technology of all kinds. The Fallen are the first enemies encountered in Destiny's history, and their continued presence speaks to their resilience and adaptability. Known for being the true threat next door to humanity, children are told to not venture beyond the protection of the last city for fear of Fallen attacks. In terms of gameplay, the Fallen fulfill this role of opportunistic mechanical geniuses by using invisibility cloaks, electrified melee weapons, and a wide assortment of mechanical drones to fight Guardians. Their unit names are also in line with the frequent pirate illusions that define their aesthetic, with cannon fodder dregs, versatile yet destructive vandals, and cowardly captains making up their ranks. Unlike the Cabal, the Fallen have been scattered for centuries, banding together under various houses that distinguish themselves with tattered cloaks bearing their sigils. While the comparison to humanity's pirates is evident on the surface and in gameplay, the lore of the Fallen reveals they have more in common with the recent state of Earth's people post-collapse. The name Fallen is an explicit act of human labeling, based on their appearance of disgraced nobility. Like humanity before it, the Elixni, the correct species name for the Fallen, experienced their own apocalypse after being uplifted by the Traveler, resulting in their pursuit of it to Earth. The Fallen's superficial semblance to human pirate culture makes them immediately recognizable, but their story and shared history involving an apocalypse and being visited by the Traveler familiarizes them more with the recent past of Destiny 2's humans. One of Destiny 2's seasons of content updates, Season of the Splicer, narratively focused on an alliance between a peaceful subsect of Fallen under the banner of House Light and the Guardians, whereby the last city provided them a home. While the Cabal alliance is shown through Cabal allies in combat, the pacifist House Light Fallen inhabit their own designated non-combat area, as well as the game's primary social space, the Tower. The presence of these beings initially causes great unrest within the city and its people, as these same aliens, sometimes the very same individuals, were responsible for the destruction and pillaging of Earth. The discontentment transformed into outright hate crimes and sabotage of fallen resources, with the rhetoric spouted by Lakshmi II, a popular leader of humanity, amplifying this hatred. Lakshmi II asks if the city, quote, can really spare the energy and resources to shelter our enemy, to shelter our enemy while humanity is under attack, unquote, a sentiment that echoes similar instances in real countries who push back against immigration. Season of the Splicer's narrative reveals how real instances of prejudice against other groups can be depicted through aliens and their interactions with humans. The notion of the other as applied sociologically is further exemplified through the pushback the Allied Fallen received due to the support of the Guardians of the City. The Fallen in Destiny 2 are positioned as the most alike to humans, and the turmoil caused by the alliance between House Light and the Guardians is inspired by hate speech and prejudice against real other groups, further reinforcing this parallel. The treatment of these Fallen is the same offered to minority and immigrant groups in today's world, bridging the gap between alien and human in the game's narrative. Next up in my analysis is the Hive, a violent race that seeks the ultimate destruction of all things in the universe in service to the light's ancient enemy, the darkness. The Hive channel their dangerous magical powers through a parasitic worm that strengthens them at the cost of their continued crusade of death, or else they are eaten by the worms themselves. Their faction's name relates to their insect-like nature of burrowing into surfaces to construct cave networks. Since their numbers are seemingly infinite, the Hive opt for pouring waves of mindless thralls led by armored knights in battle. Their unit naming conventions are derived from a specific point in history, but split between fact and fiction. Hive units are named from the medieval era of kings and knights, but also the mythology that accompanied these times. Wizards and ogres make up their more powerful ranks, further reinforcing both an inspiration from human mythology, as well as the idea that the beings most in tune with their magic are the strongest. The Hive operate on a tribute tithe system, another factor linking them to medieval history. although instead of the taxes and wealth flowing upwards towards the king, it is instead raw power gained through the destruction of others. Thralls receive the smallest share, keeping them small and mindless, with this tribute flowing upwards until it reaches one of the three hive gods, who are even titled kings and queens. The hive use imagery associated with insect infestations, combined with labels and sociobiologic systems that relate them to a specific point in humanity's history and mythology, thus making an otherwise incomprehensible, death-driven race understandable to the player. Another major link between medieval humanity and the hive is the divine right of kings, the idea that European medieval royalty got their status directly from God rather than from the people that they rule. Like these kings, the hive gods believed themselves to be chosen by the darkness to rule, as they elevated their formerly frail people into what they are today. The reality of the hive's past is that they were not chosen divinely, but were stolen from the traveler by the darkness to help destroy it. Like how medieval kings falsely believed that they were chosen to lead their people, the hive gods were the result of revenge rather than destiny. Furthermore, the hive's crusade operates on the idea of the sword logic, basically a version of survival of the fittest. If the hive encounter and defeat a force in the universe, then this force did not deserve to exist to begin with. However, the hive exempt themselves from their own vulnerability to this maxim, as the most powerful leaders can only be killed within their own throne world, a pocket dimension formed via their conquest that saves them from death in the material plane. In-game, some hive leaders are continually resurrected by way of these throne worlds, sometimes even gaining power through defeat. Hypocrisy and deception lie at the heart of the hive's core tenets, revealing that their divinity and all-encompassing rules are constructed solely for their own benefit, much like the kingships of the medieval era. The hive function as a twisted, exacerbated rendition of medieval European royalty, with logic loopholes that lower them from some divine calling to a more self-serving people. While they lack sympathetic characters and allies like the Cabal and Fallen, their othered status is nonetheless reduced through their similarities with human medieval history and an ultimately false belief in their own superiority via higher powers. My examination continues with the most mysterious group, the time-traveling robots of the Vex Collective. The Vex seek to assimilate all life to their own designs, terraforming worlds and creating massive technological constructs to better control their territory. Like the Hive's genocidal crusade, the Vex believe themselves to be the ideal form for the universe, although the way they enact this is through building rather than warfare. Beyond this large-scale goal, the motivations behind the Vex network are shrouded in mystery and speculation, and with no distinct personalities or named figures to divulge information, they remain almost as unknown as when Destiny began. Their faction name symbolizes the elusiveness of their goals, with their very nature being obtuse and incomprehensible. The closest limited way that humanity can understand the Vex is by relating them to something else, something equally mystifying. In this case, it is to the wealth of Greek mythological monsters that many of the Vex units are named after, including Minotaurs, Cyclops, and Harpies. These names speak to a wider understanding of how humanity in Destiny 2 can even grasp a force as incredibly alien as the Vex. In an article on the art of naming and sci-fi, Noel Go and Chessa Adzib-Morris claim that, quote, names are not inherent in nature. They are impositions of human minds, unquote, following the example of various seabird names, only one of which relates to its worth to humans. The act of naming is inherently human, signifying a need to categorize and identify the unknown. The Vex are named after mythological creatures because, like these myths, they are abstract and different in ways that make this a necessity to better understand them. If the Hive reflect both historical and fictional human ideas, the Vex are entirely derived from myth, being a pure sci-fi menace with unknowable goals and a lack of personality. Through the labeling of Vex units using known mythology, they are at least partly familiarized to humanity, although they still firmly exist as an unreachable, monstrous force. The final pair of Destiny 2's enemy aliens are the ones most closely aligned with the series' overarching antagonist, the Darkness. These groups are not naturally formed alien civilizations, nor do they possess characters such as the likes of Keitel. Instead, I argue that the Darkness factions are even more other than the rest of the game's extraterrestrials because of their origins with the universe's cosmic evil. There is very little in them that relates to humanity, but it's instead through this factor's absence that they are defined. First up are the Scorn, a relatively new set of foes in comparison to the game's other factions. The Scorn are the reanimated corpses of dead Fallen, fueled by a corrupted variation of their life force, Ether. A Scorn can be resurrected an infinite number of times after defeat, but doing so results in a gradual physical and mental degradation. Regardless of how newly revived they are, the Scorn are devoid of the personality and history that the Fallen possess, serving as their equivalent to humanity's modern zombie myth. Their unit naming conventions reflect this monstrous nature, including abominations, wraiths, and stalkers. Lazardi's discussion on the Gears of War games brings up naming in a way relatable to the Scorns, stating that, quote, "The language used to describe the invading forces in these post-apocalyptic video games is abrasive and vitriolic, as this language always reflects the explicit distinction between insiders and outsiders," unquote. In a similar manner, the Scorn are othered not just by humanity, but by the Fallen as well. Little remains of Fallen culture and battle tactics in the Scorn. There are no machines in their ranks, and they do not make much effort to defend themselves. Narratively, the Scorn are used more as a tool to create further sympathy for the Fallen than to be developed on their own accord, instead being derived from modern human fears applied to an alien race that already bears the most similarity to humanity. The Scorn are a powerful representation of an othered alien, yet this othering is still rooted in human storytelling. The final enemy faction in my analysis is the one furthest removed from any semblance of humanity, the Taken. These creatures are created when a powerful darkness-aligned entity transports another being to another dimension, or takes them. In this place, their personality and mind are hollowed out, while their physical being is enhanced with additional powers that improve their combat prowess. As a result, the Taken are made up of the four major Destiny factions all working together, but without the culture and personalities that defined them. Instead, they operate as puppets controlled by their current master, lacking individual agency. In terms of gameplay, the Taken are improved from their exposure to the darkness by being gifted powers that make up for their previous shortcomings. Minotaurs gain invisibility to reduce their otherwise large visual presence, Vandals create defensive shields when under fire, and Thralls teleport unpredictably instead of rushing straight towards players. The darkness proves itself to be the antithesis to humanity in the way that it reduces its servants to their base function as weapons to enact its will. Taken even lack the specific naming conventions that have helped identify factions with certain elements of humanity. A Taken unit has no specific name, but is referred to as a Taken blank. The absence of a human reference point for this faction furthers the notion that the Taken are the epitome of a true alien other, but not as one that possesses its own distinct culture wholly different from our own. Instead, the lack of this relatability is what others the Taken in a way different from the rest of the game's factions, and many aliens in sci-fi at large. To recall Litchfield et al.'s argument, because of our inability to fully step outside of our own humanness, stories about aliens and their own cultures are always derivative in some form of our own. The Taken are an attempt to create something truly alien, but not through the addition of an alternate history and culture, but the removal of any. The Taken embody a sense of otherness by lacking individuality altogether. In this presentation, I have argued that Destiny 2's alien enemy factions define their otherness through their connections to humanity's own history, cultures, and myths. Each of the 6 groups examined are innately other by way of being the enemies in Bungie's sci-fi first-person shooter, but the ways that they are named and identified, combined with their relationships to specific human influences, make these otherwise alien and unknowable groups familiar and comprehensible. In some cases, the other status of these aliens is reduced through their connections to human history and presence of relatable characters and situations, such as in the Cabal and Fallen. For others, their connections to humanity do not necessarily make them friendly, but rather provide a perspective in which to understand an otherwise overwhelming foe, in the cases of the Hive and Vex. Finally, the remaining factions that are most closely aligned with evil are the most othered, due to a further removal from already alien cultures. The Scorn and the Taken have their othered status enhanced by presenting an absence of personality and culture, something that is inherently impossible for humans. Destiny 2's wide array of combatants are made distinct via their lore and gameplay, but their status as other is not stagnant. Like how the game itself is constantly updating, Destiny 2's enemies occupy more than one position on the scale of human relatability. These positions shift as time goes on, but the ways in which they are defined via their inextricable connections to humanity's history and storytelling remain constant. Destiny 2 is, as all works, derived from people, and the best way to make other enemies understandable is to make them subtly familiar. Thank you. And that's that.